Hey you guys, it's Victoria. So in today's video, we are going to be looking at some key differences between American and Canadian English. Today's video topic is something that I'm asked about very frequently. So I thought it's about time to make a video about this topic. That being said, I have to start off by mentioning that there is not one American accent, nor is there one Canadian accent. There are multiple dialects across North America, many dozen. So my experience is what's going to dictate the content of this video. So to give you guys a bit of background about myself, I've lived and studied and worked in both Canada and in the United States throughout my life, both for years at a time. I grew up in Ottawa, Ontario, and then I first moved to the United States in my low 20s for school. Now, obviously, I didn't have to change my pronunciation when I moved to the States. However, my experience was that people were constantly asking me where I was from, my life story, and not that I mind sharing, but it just got old extremely quickly. So now I can kind of do a retrospective analysis and tell you guys about some of these words. However, at the time, it's just something that my auditory perceptual system was able to do for me. So it's not like I sat down with a notebook and tried to find words and practiced them. My subconscious auditory perceptual algorithm just spotted these differences and made the changes so that after a while, no one was commenting about where are you from on a regular basis. All right, so let's get into it, you guys. So for each of these words, I'm going to tell you how I began to pronounce this word when I moved to the States. And then I'm going to tell you how I used to pronounce this word when I lived in Canada. So the first word is project. Like I'm working on a really interesting project in the States. In Canada, I grew up saying project. So as you guys can hear, the difference is in the vowel. In the States, it tends to be ah. In Canada, it tends to be o. Next up is the word organization. Like he has excellent organization skills. So if you listen to the first three syllables of that word, we have or, g, n. So the second and third syllables are both schwas. In Canada, I grew up saying organization. So as you can hear, that third syllable in Canada is pronounced as a full I, whereas in the States, it's reduced to schwa. So the third word is Z, as in the final letter of the alphabet. And in Canada, we tend to pronounce this as Z. Now this was an interesting one because when I first moved, I really didn't feel the need to say Z, so I continued to say Z. And there happens to be a Z or Z in my last name, so this is something that I'd spell a lot over the phone. And I noticed very quickly that many Americans that I spoke to had no idea what Z was when I said Z. So this is one that I quickly switched actually because of true miscommunication, which I think is actually really interesting. So the next word is sorry, as in, I'm sorry to hear that. And in Canada, I grew up saying sorry. So this word's interesting. So for myself, nowadays, I tend to say sorry, whether I'm in Canada or in the States, almost exclusively. Once in a great while, I'll slip out a sorry. And it's really funny, like I even catch myself doing it. It sounds really unusual to my ears, which is bizarre because that's certainly what I grew up hearing and saying. But of note as well, I recently read an article that Canadian speech in general is kind of leaning more American, and the article specifically mentioned the word sorry as one of the words that's changing. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't remember the name of the article or who wrote it, but it's just something that's been in the back of my mind as a cool fact. The next word is garage. So where you park your car. So garage in the States tends to be pronounced with a j at the end, but I grew up pronouncing this as garage with a j at the end, which would be more similar to the French pronunciation. So I'll mention that for this word, I've certainly met many Americans that say garage as well, but this is one of the things that I noted when I first moved to New York. Next up, we have the word Tuesday, as in the day of the week. So Americans tend to say Tuesday. Canadians tend to say Tuesday. So the tu sound definitely comes from more of a British pronunciation. So this is a word that I've never really adopted the American pronunciation ever. So most of the time I'm still gonna say Tuesday instead of Tuesday when I'm not really thinking about it. Next up, we have the word progress. You're making excellent progress on your report. And in Canada, I grew up saying progress. So this one you'll notice is similar to the one we saw earlier, project, project, progress, progress. Next up, we have the word been. How have you been? In Canada, I grew up saying been. How have you been? So this is a difference of reduction, right? If I had to be super general about how American and Canadian English differs, it would be that American English reduces much more often than Canadian English. So this would be a perfect example of that. Nowadays, I've totally stopped using been in my spoken speech. So you'll never catch me saying, how have you been? That feels really unnatural for me nowadays. Next up, we have the word kilometer. Kilometer. So that's how I started saying it when I moved to the States. So you're going to hear it's schwa, winner, schwa. Kilometer. Kilometer. In Canada, I grew up saying kilometer. So you can hear the stress is totally different. So in the Canadian version, ki is the winner, and then we have a schwa, and then meter, both in full form. Kilometer, kilometer. Of course, in the States, people don't tend to say kilometer, nor do they tend to say kilometer because everything's in miles, so just keep that in mind. Next up, we have the word adult. He's a responsible adult. In Canada, I grew up saying adult. So as you can hear, the difference is in the word stress. This next one kind of cracks me up. So the word is herb. So she likes to cook with a lot of herbs and spices. So as you can hear, the H is not pronounced in most varieties of American English. However, in Canada, the H usually is pronounced, so you're gonna hear herb. So this one I say cracks me up because this is a word that actually I just assumed I was saying incorrectly my whole life when I began hearing herb. I didn't assume that it was a difference between Canada and the US because it's so rare that a consonant would be entirely omitted. So this one was just kind of funny, but herb, herb. So next up we have the word aunt, as in I'm going to be visiting my aunt and my uncle over the weekend. So most Americans that I know tend to say aunt. However, most Canadians that I know say aunt, and that's how I grew up saying this word. This one's interesting too. Recently, I put up a video in which I wanted you guys to find my pronunciation mistakes, and it was a video about my cousin's baby shower. And so because it was about my cousin, I shared it in my cousin group on WhatsApp. And of course they wrote in the answers, even though they're native English speakers. So what was really interesting, my cousin's wife, Andrea, one of the mistakes she identified was actually when I said aunt, because she's grown up saying aunt. So it's just a really interesting example how we're so strongly influenced by where we're from. She didn't assume that this was a difference. She thought this was something I did intentionally to show a mistake. Next up, we have the word produce, as in I like to eat a lot of produce, fruits and vegetables, right? So in Canada, I grew up saying produce. So this one's kind of interesting, right? Because in general, if we're generalizing, the Canadian way tends to be with the O vowel, like we saw earlier with project or process. And this one is the opposite. So in this case, produce is the American one. No, produce is the Canadian one and produce is the American. Oh my goodness. So in this case, produce is the Canadian way and produce is the American way. Go figure. So next up we have the word mountain, as in she loves to go mountain climbing. And in Canada, I grew up saying mountain. So as you can hear in the American way, there's an N followed by a glottal stop, mount, and the Canadian way, the T is released. So If I had to identify one pattern that really marked me as a Canadian when I first moved to the US, it would be my release of T sounds. In the States, the T's are released much, much less frequently, and in Canada, relatively, they're released a lot more. So if you're even just thinking in terms of pure acoustic information, mountain, mountain, they're very, very different, right? So I could see why this kind of a pattern would be very conspicuous. Next up, we have the word huh. So this isn't so much a pronunciation difference as it is a totally different word usage, but I thought it was a really interesting one to mention anyway. So in the States, you may hear someone saying, "That was a good movie, huh?" Whereas in Canada, you may hear someone saying, "That was a good movie, eh?" So I grew up saying a lot. I said it all the time. And after I moved to the States, my American friends and family members made so much fun of me that I've really stopped using a, and I haven't said it for years now. What's interesting though is that I still don't use huh very often. I think it's because in Canada, huh is often perceived as rude. And so even though I know it's not rude, and even though my family members use huh all the time, it's just we tend to clutch really tightly to the politeness rules that we were taught in our youth. So this just isn't a word that I've adopted. Next up, we have the word button. Button. So very similar to mountain, mountain, but I grew up saying button, but when I moved to the States, I heard button all the time. Next up, we have t, as in I'm going to the store. So in this sentence, you'll hear that I'm using the word to, T-O, in its reduced form, which is definitely appropriate because it's not a very interesting word. So in the States, it's very common to reduce to ta, a really, really short ta, so to ti, schwa. In Canada, however, it's really common to not reduce as much, so you will frequently hear to. I'm going to the store. Nowadays, I find it much more physically cumbersome to say to instead of ta. So this is one that I would say I almost always say in the American way. Next up, we have the word internet, as in I have a really fast internet connection. And in Canada, I grew up saying internet with that T being released. So this one I think is kind of interesting because in Canada, some words lose that T in NT blends, like you'll really often hear 20 instead of 20, but some words not so much. So in Canada, I would say that internet is used more frequently than internet. In the States, you'll really hear a mix of both. However, where I was living, internet was more popular. Next up, we have the word pasta, as in I'm gonna have pasta for supper tonight. And in Canada, I grew up saying pasta with an a sound, not the ah sound that you heard in the American version. So last up we have excuse me. So you'll hear excuse me in both Canada and in the United States. However, instead of excuse me, I grew up often saying pardon me. So if you didn't hear someone, you might say pardon. In the States, you may hear someone say, excuse me, but in the States, you'll often just hear someone say, what? So what is much more widely used in the United States, and it's totally normal and it's not seen as rude. In Canada, if you go from pardon me to what, that's a huge difference on the politeness scale. So nowadays, I don't tend to ever say pardon me. However, initially, this was kind of a culture shock for me. So I know that my channel is about the American accent and pronunciation and stress patterns. However, when I moved to the US from the first time, I did live through many culture shocks. So if you guys do want to hear about that, I'd be happy to make a video for you. Let me know in the comments below. If you prefer that I stick to what we do, then let me know as well. And based on what you guys write, I'll proceed accordingly. So that's it for today's video, you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you always for your kind support and comments. I truly, truly appreciate it. And I hope to see you again soon. Take care. Bye.